Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. My name is Bill Benson. I have hosted the museum's First Person program since it began in 2000. Through these monthly conversations, we bring you firsthand accounts of survival of the Holocaust. Each of our first person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. Jewish Holocaust survivors are those who were displaced, persecuted, or discriminated against due to the racial, religious, ethnic, social, and political policies of the Nazis and their collaborators between 1933 and 1945. This included inmates of concentration camps, ghettos, and prisons, as well as refugees and those in hiding. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Albert Garih share his individual, personal account of the Holocaust with us today. During our program, please send us your questions and let us know where you are joining us from in the chat. Albert, thank you so much for agreeing to be our first person today.
Thank you.
Albert, you have so much to share with us in our short time together today. Please begin by telling us a bit about your early life.
Well, I was born in 1938, which was not a very glorious year. It was the year of the Anschluss, of Munich, and Kristallnacht. So it was not a very, it was a very threatening year, actually. And my parents were from Turkey. They had moved to France in 1923. It's a long story, but Turkey was part of the Ottoman Empire. And since the Ottoman Empire joined forces with Germany during the First World War, when Germany was defeated in the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled. And then came a strong man by the name of Mustafa Kemal, or Ataturk, which means the father of modern Turkey. And the Jews started, to feel uncomfortable. They didn't know what was in store with this new strong man. And a lot of Jews decided to immigrate.
Including both your parents, who I believe didn't know each other at that time.
No, they didn't know each other. They met in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, they went to France because they had been educated in a school of Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was an international organization which opened schools all over the Ottoman Empire where education was provided in French. So my parents were perfectly fluent in French.
Albert, apart from being fluent in French, you described to me your father as smart but self-educated. Tell us a bit about your father.
Yeah, my father did go to school until the age of 10. That was it. At the age of 10, he was taken out of school. He started working to help his parents. That's how, they were poor, and that's what happened.
Mm-hmm. And how about your mom? Tell us a little bit about her.
My mom was more educated. My mom was schooled until the age of 17 or 18. She got a degree called le brevet supérieur. At that time, it was equivalent of baccalaureate, actually. And so she had a longer education than my father.
Yeah. And Albert, by the time you came along in that terrible year of 1938, your parents had already had 2 children. And
yes.
Tell us about your siblings.
Yeah, my parents immigrated in 1923, and they met in 27 and married in 1928. And my elder sister, who passed away of COVID a couple of months ago, Jacqueline.
I'm so sorry to hear that, Albert.
Thank you.
Yeah.
She was born in 1930. My younger sister, Gilberte, was born in 1933, and I was born in 1938.
Albert, tell us a little bit, if you don't mind, about your family's economic circumstances?
Well, it was not brilliant, to say the least. My father was an accountant. He was working in a garment factory. He was doing the payroll of all the employees of the factory. And his boss was also a Jew, and he had allowed us to live in the janitor's apartment because he knew that we were struggling. My parents were struggling with three. Actually, we were four children at that time. But I was a twin. My twin brother died at the age of 6 months.
Yeah.
But
Albert, the year after you were born, 1939, that's when World War II began, when Germany invaded Poland. But the war really didn't come to France until Germany attacked France in May of 1940. You were nearly 2 years old at that time when German troops advanced on Paris. Nearly 80% of Paris's population fled the city. And you said to me that for your family, it all began with the exodus from Paris. Will you say more about what you meant by that?
yeah, well, that's when we started to be struck by tragedy. Actually, my grandmother, who had gone to do some shopping to get some food for us, she was caught in a bombardment and she was killed by strafing. And my mother had a brother and a sister who were my uncle had a car and they were driving south. They were in Orleans already, and they were caught in a bombardment, and a bomb fell on their car. And that each one of them had a son with them, and all the four of them were killed when a bomb fell on their car.
And that was all happening during the Exodus. Albert, we don't have a photograph of the Exodus, of course, but we do have a piece of art by a survivor which shows the mass of humanity fleeing Paris on foot, bikes, and cars and wagons. And in my head, that Exodus is like a scene from a movie with hundreds of thousands of people running by any means they can. And that included you and your family. Where did you end up once you left Paris in the midst of those thousands and thousands of others?
Well, according to my sisters, because I have no recollection, I was a baby, I was 2 years old. We took a train to Orleans. Orleans is a city on the River Loire. The River Loire is famous for its beautiful chateaux all along, Chenonceau, Chambord, Blois, and so on. And we even slept, I don't know whether it was one night or several nights, in a chateau called Chateau de Ville-Savin there. It sounds very exciting, but it was not, because we were sleeping on the floor. And I was crying because my mother didn't have anything to feed me. And I was crying and disturbing the peace of the other people who had stayed in that chateau. And at one point, there was a soldier who had escaped, had fled when the French army was caught by the German army. And he was there. He had a flask of schnapps. And he gave a shot of schnapps to my mother, and he said, try to give him that. Maybe that will calm him down. And apparently it did.
The schnapps worked.
Yes.
Albert, your father wasn't with you when you fled Paris, was he?
No, my father decided to stay, to keep on working, to make his living. If he had left his job, we would have been without any money.
Yeah. And is that the reason that after you were staying at the chateau, you ended up returning to Paris?
Yes, we returned to Paris because we had nowhere else to go. We had no relatives anywhere else, except maybe in Turkey, but we didn't have any relatives, actually.
So the only place to go was back to Paris, which now, of course, is occupied by the Germans.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. And that's where we started to suffer from the restrictive laws that were promulgated by the collaborationist government of Pierre Laval, who decided to collaborate with the German army. And they promulgated the Statute of the Jews that was depriving the Jews of most of their basic rights. We were not allowed in public transit. We were not allowed, we were allowed only 1 hour to do the grocery shopping between, I think it was 4 and 5 in the afternoon, and that was it. So we were not allowed to go to the movies or to socialize, anything. We had no radio.
Because you weren't allowed to have radios, right?
We were not allowed. I think my parents had a radio before, but it was confiscated.
Right.
I don't know. But anyway, we didn't have any radio. And so we were really deprived of most of our basic rights.
Yeah. Albert, before you continue, I'd like to share with you that we have viewers watching us from, frankly, around the globe. We have viewers watching today here in the United States from Minnesota, Florida, Iowa, Maine, and Puerto Rico. And then we have international viewers from places like Canada, the Philippines, Germany, and Denmark. So you're being listened to carefully from many places in this world of ours. So Albert, you came back to Paris. The Germans and the collaborationist French began imposing all kinds of restrictions, but you would stay there for 2 years until June 1942. Tell us what forced your family to finally flee with those restrictions that you were having to live under, like you said, shop only 1 hour a day. What finally forced you to have to leave your home in June of 1942?
What happened is that, we were living in the janitor's apartment of the factory. We were like the concierge of the factory. And the factory belonged to a Jew, Monsieur Talheimer, which means inhabitant of the valley. And Monsieur Talheimer was dispossessed of his factory, and he had to flee. And we were evicted from our apartment, and we had to find an apartment in no time. In July 1942. July 1942 was one of the worst months during the French occupation. That's when the biggest roundup of all took place, La Rafle du Veldiv. And where they rounded up, the Germans had asked for 20,000 men to go to work to Germany, but the French government could not, they managed to send only 13,000, but not men, women, children, elderly people, everybody. And all these people ended up in concentration camps, actually.
And here, Albert, I think we have a scene from one of the roundups where Jews are being rounded up and herded into trucks.
Yes, and you can see it's the French police that is performing this dirty job, actually.
As you said to me on another occasion, Albert, it was the July or June of 1942 when the Germans and the French collaborationist government really turned the screws with these massive roundups. So you had to find another place, as you said. What kind of place were you able to find?
We found a tiny apartment, 2 rooms, not 2 bedrooms, 2 rooms, and a tiny kitchen and a toilet. That was it.
2 rooms, 5 of you.
Yes, cold water. That was all the comfort we had.
So at that point, your parents decided they needed to find another place for you. What did your parents do then?
Well, it was not so much because the apartment was too small, but it was because it was dangerous, because they were rounding up people like crazy, whole families, grandparents, parents, children. So my parents wanted to spare us the danger of being rounded up, and they decided to send us to a farm in Thoiry. Thoiry is a suburb of Paris. Actually, it's a remote suburb. Actually, it was mostly at that time it was mostly farmland, but today there is a safari park there. But in those days it was just farmland. So my sisters would go to school, and I would stay with the ladies. It was two ladies who were tending the farm.
So there were no men at this house.
Probably the husband had been taken prisoner with the French army.
Right.
I never saw a man there, and I was too young to ask questions like that. So it's just what I assume now.
And of course, eventually you had to leave that place as well. Tell us why you had to leave that farm.
Yeah, because my sisters would go to school, and I would stay with the two ladies, and I would talk. And I was very social, so I was talking to them. And one day in the conversation, I told them that we were Jewish. My parents had not told them that we were Jewish. They just said that we would be better fed in a farm than in Paris, where food was very scarce. Mm-hmm. So when they heard that we were Jewish, they sent us right back to our parents. They didn't want to take any chances being exposed, hiding Jewish children.
Which would have been dangerous for them, I guess,
yes,
right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So you return to your parents, your sisters, and you go back. In September of 1943, your father was taken for forced labor to the Channel Islands between England and France. Soon after that, your mother, your sisters, and you went into hiding. Tell us what you can about your father being forced to leave to go to forced labor, and then your mother finding a place for the rest of the family to hide.
Well, it was not easy. My father was taken away in September 1943, and my mother was terrified. This is the card that was made of my Garih Benjamin, that's my father. And if you read, you have deported, it means he was deported in a camp on the Channel Island of Origny, which is in the Channel between France and Britain, actually. And they were building what they call the Atlantic Wall, trying to stop the invasion from the Allies. So they were building bunkers, blockhouses, and
this was all done by forced laborers like your father being forced to do this work.
Yes, under very rough conditions.
Because, that card you just showed us, Albert, that was specifically about your father being deported to that island. That's something you actually came across at the museum, right?
Exactly. There's a gentleman on the second floor in the museum. I went to see him. He had a computer. I said, "Can you find something about my father?" And he checked, and he found that card.
Wow. So, Albert, I know you remember. You've told me that you actually remember your father leaving you.
Absolutely. No, actually, when he left, he had to take the metro. The metro was about a little more than a mile away from our home. Usually we would take a bus to go to the metro station. But that time we walked. We wanted to spend a little more time with with my father. And so we walked all the way to the metro station. I remember my father carrying his gas mask. He had a box, a cylindrical box, in which he had his gas mask. They were provided gas mask because they were afraid that there might be a danger of gas warfare like there was during the First World War.
Right.
So.
And you remember that. Albert, if you don't mind, we have a question from an audience member who asks, How did it feel for you to be separated from your father at such a young age?
You know, I had been separated from my parents when we were in Thoiry
That's
already. You
true.
know, I had some experience of separation already. So I don't think I really realized at that time that I might not see him again. And I was just a kid. I was 4 years old. So, you know, and that my sisters were much more traumatized than I was.
Mm-hmm.
They were older.
A little bit older than you. Albert, before we talk about what your mother then did with her children, with you and your siblings, your father suffered a terrible injury while he was doing that forced labor at Alderney.
Yeah, my father had a terrible accident. He was working on the scaffolding, carrying a trough of cement on his head, and he stepped on a loose board, and the board came to hit him on the head, and he fell off a cliff. And he was losing his blood, and he was picked up some time later by the soup truck.
Yeah. And he was able to survive that. How and your mother, I guess your mother was able to be in touch with your father to learn about this.
Yeah, that's the only thing that I don't understand is that apparently they were able to exchange letters, and I remember vividly the letter, not the letters, but the envelopes, because I couldn't read. It was 5 years, 4 or 5 years.
Right.
But I remember the envelope with the eagle and the swastika on the postmark.
The Nazi postmark. Yeah.
Yes.
So with your father gone, your mom has to spring into action. She's got 3 children and herself to find a place to go. Tell us what she did.
Yeah, she was terrified at the idea that we might be taken away because you know they would come at night in the middle of the night. They would bang on the door house, and they would take people out and send them to a camp. And from
Mm-hmm.
that transit camp north of Paris, in anyway, I forgot the name now. But they were sent after that to Auschwitz.
From
So
this transit camp like Drancy, they would be sent to Auschwitz. Yeah. Yeah.
it's funny, I don't remember the name of the camp, and I visited that camp 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah. Albert, so your mom, she's terrified. She knows that there's risk every moment. How did she find shelter?
Yeah, the name of the camp was Drancy.
Drancy, yep.
I forgot the name now. I had forgotten the name. I'm sorry, what did you ask?
How your mom was then able to find a place to take you for safety at that time.
It was almost miraculous. She met this lady, Madame Gallo, in a street market. She had never seen her before. She had never met her before. And somehow she felt she could open up to her. And she told her that she was terrified that at any moment they could come and take us away. And this lady, Madame Gallo, went home to her husband and told her husband the story. And the next day, her husband came to us with a cart, and we took whatever personal effects we could, and we went to live with the Gallo family. The Gallo family, it was they had two daughters. I was 5, and they had 2 daughters, 4 and 3. And you know, hiding a Jewish family was very dangerous for them, because if they had been caught hiding a Jewish family, they would have been deported just like us.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody would have gone. So these people were heroic to me. But you know, they were Protestant. The Catholic, there were some Catholic people who had helped also, but it was mostly a Protestant family, because they had a history of persecutions with the Catholics, precisely in France. We had wars of religions in the 17th century, and so that stayed with them, and they were very sympathetic to our plea, actually. And they came to Monsieur Gallo came with a cot, and we took whatever we could, and we went to live with them, and we stayed with them for about 6 months, I would say.
And before you move on from there, Albert, I'd like to do two things. One is remind our audience to please share any questions you have for Albert through the chat feature. Please share your questions. And we've got one that has come in, Albert, I'd like to ask you from our audience member. This person asks, how did your mother know that she could trust Mrs. Gallo?
She didn't know.
She didn't know.
I guess, it was our instinct. Probably she felt that she was in front of a woman who was really understanding her situation and was willing to help us. But it was a gamble, Anyway, what was the alternative? Staying home and being taken away?
Right.
So we went to live with the Gallo family, and the Gallo family was absolutely wonderful.
I think we now have a photograph from that time. Tell us about this photograph, Albert.
This is a picture taken of my mother, my sisters, and me in January 1944, when my father was in captivity. And my mother had this picture taken, and she sent it to my father.
Because they were able to write to each other, as you said.
Yes, they were, for whatever, that's one of the mysteries, because people, once they were sent to a camp in Poland, that was it, that there was no way to communicate. But when he was in that camp in the Channel Island, he was still able to communicate with us and to write to us. And I remember vividly the envelopes, not the letters, but the envelope with the postmark.
Yeah. And Albert, you've described that time, that 6 months with the Gallos, as for you a pretty happy time. Mr. Gallo himself was a sculptor. Tell us what he did as a sculptor.
He was working for the movie studios, and he was making movie sets, and they had a big warehouse behind the house where they were storing all these sets. And we had great hide and seek games with Janine and Mireille, the two little girls, in that warehouse.
Albert, I know that, as just sort of an aside, I know that you are a really serious movie fan, movie buff. Do you think that has any connection back to that time?
I don't think so. No, it was just that, in those days there was no television, there was nothing. So the only distraction we had, entertainment, was to go to the movie matinees, Sunday matinees, to the movies. And we would go almost religiously, the whole family, my father, my mother, my sisters, and me. And, they were not very discriminating about the movies. It was the movie of the day, of the week.
Whatever it was.
Whatever it was. That's where I discovered Chaplin. That's where I discovered Errol Flynn in Robin Hood. These are, to me, these were a cultural shock, right, to see that.
I can imagine. And Albert, of course, while you're playing hide and seek, for your mom and perhaps for your sisters as well, it was a time of fear. Can you say anything about that?
Yes, my mother was constantly afraid that somebody might report us. Actually, there was a lady in the street. I will come to that in a minute. But yes, we were in constant danger of being reported, and it was dangerous for us, but it was also dangerous for the Gallo family, because if we had been reported, they would have taken us away, but they would have taken the Gallo family, their children, their two daughters, with them. So these people were, I very often wondered whether I would have had the courage that they showed to take a big gamble of hiding a Jewish family during that period.
And of course, after 6 months, you had to leave the Gallos. Tell us why you had to leave their home, because that had been quite a sanctuary for you.
Well, actually, the Gallo were living in a small house in a small street. There were about 10 houses altogether. It was mostly artists, painters, sculptors, and there was a painter whose wife was a great admirer of the Reich and
Of the Nazis. Yeah.
the Nazis, and a notorious anti-Semite. And one day, she went to see Madame Gallo because they knew that we were living with the Gallo family. And she went to see her and said, "When are you going to get rid of that scum?" So we were the scum. At that point, my mother and Madame Gallo thought it might be safer for us to go home because who knows, she might be tempted to report us. So we went back home.
Which, of course, was a place where your mom had been so afraid that there would be a knock on the door. So what happened?
Well, sure enough, a few weeks later, was around June 1944, around D-Day, actually. One day, one morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, we were still, my sisters and me, we were still in bed. My mother was up. There was a knock on the door. Two French police inspectors. Madame Garih, yes, we came to take you away. That was what my mother had been dreading all along.
Right.
She started shaking, and they said, "Calm down. We're going to report we didn't find you. But you must not sleep in your bed tonight. You have to find another place." So, anyway,
So she had to find another place. How did she do that?
well, she was given the name of a social worker, Mademoiselle Desjobert. I still remember the name. And and she dressed me very quickly. I was still in bed, when that happened. And she dressed me very quickly. My sisters, we all went to see the social worker, Mademoiselle Desjobert, and to explain the situation. And this social worker said, "You know what, you have to allow me a few days because I cannot find a hiding place for each one of you like this overnight. So see in the meantime if you can sleep at your neighbors, not in your apartment. Because if they come back to your apartment and they bang on the door and they find you there, they're going to take you away." So my mother, we went back to our neighbors, and the neighbors were wonderful, actually. They all offered to take us, and we stayed. My mother and I stayed with our next door neighbors, a communist couple. She was working in a print shop, and he was making wrought iron banisters. He made one in the Palace of Monaco, actually. That was one of his
Banisters for stairs, right? Yeah.
banisters. Yes. And he made the one for the staircase at the Monaco Palace,
Wow.
Prince Rainier. And so they were working on night shifts. His wife, I understand, because she was working in a print shop, so maybe they were printing newspapers, I don't know, but they were working on night shifts. So we would sleep in their bed at night, and in the morning, when they would come back, we would give them the bed and stay in the apartment. And we stayed like that for a few days until eventually the social worker came back to my mother and said, "I found a place for each one of you." And my mother was placed as a governess with a family of 8 or 10 children near the Eiffel Tower. And we were placed in Catholic boarding schools in a suburb east of Paris, Montfermeil, which is made famous by an episode of Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. That's where Jean Valjean meets Cosette, actually, in Montfermeil.
Which is where the boarding school was that you were in?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Before you tell us about the boarding school, your mother the social worker somehow found basically a job for her as a governess. Obviously, that family, I'm assuming, had no idea who your mother really was.
I suppose so. I have no idea about that.
Yeah,
I
but
never.
she was caring for 8
She,
or 10 kids.
yes, it was a big family. That's all
Wow.
I know. And but she had no way to communicate with us and to know exactly. Well, she knew where we were. That's all. She
But
knew we were in these boarding schools in Montfermeil, but she had no way. First of all, there was no transport. There was no trains or anything like that. And it would have been very dangerous for her to take a train to come to see us. So we were completely cut out of our mother. Our father was deported.
still away, and um,
So, and uh, and I was completely isolated because my sisters were in a school for girls and I was in a school for boys. I would meet them every Sunday in church because it
you'd
was
meet your sisters in church every Sunday.
yes because it was a it was Catholic boarding school, so they would take us to mass every Sunday morning, and that's when I would see my sisters.
Albert, before I continue asking you questions, I think we have now a question by video from a student, Isabella, who's from Gillespie High School. So let's hear Isabella's question.
Hi, I'm Isabella Wallace and I'm from Gillespie High School, and I'm here to ask you a question. While attending boarding school and being away from your family, how did you feel and what were your easiest and your most difficult experiences there?
Isabella asks, um,
No,
how did you feel? How did you feel being in the boarding school? And she asks, what were your easiest and most difficult experiences while you were there?
uh, I don't think there was any easy. The easiest thing that I can remember about is the my connection with the headmistress. She was very protective of me. She was probably the one who took me into hiding in that school, and she was very attentive to me actually all the time, all the time. She was like a surrogate mother for me for that
Mm.
period. But
And you remember that, right?
oh yes,
Yeah.
yes. And actually, I wanted to have her recognized as a righteous among the nations, but I never knew her name, so I
Oh,
was not able to do that.
right.
I went back years later and I investigated. I couldn't find an answer. I couldn't find anyone who could give me the name of that person.
Mhm.
She was wonderful.
Albert, of course, the other part of Isabella's question was, what was most difficult for you while at the boarding school?
Well, the fact that I was beside uh, the help and the support from the headmistress, it was the fact that I was completely cut out of my family. I would see my sisters once a week on Sunday in church, and that was it. The rest of the time, I was on my own. I was I was 6 years old. Can you imagine a 6-year-old boy cut out of his family? But I had already some experience because we had been in that uh, in Thoiry and in that farm before, so I had to make do with that.
Yeah. And Albert, you shared with us the how kind to you the headmistress was towards you and took you under her wing, but conditions were really tough for you there, for everybody, I guess. What was the food circumstances like for you?
The toughest thing in that school was the food. The food was terrible, but of course it was the war. Well,
Right.
I don't blame it particularly on that school, but we were fed. It was terrible. I remember the rotten beans. I remember that I was constantly sick. I was suffering from my stomach, and and I lost a lot of weight there. I was very skinny. So
You shared with me, Albert, that um, you were actually treated in a sense with mashed potatoes. Yes.
Yeah, actually, the priest was suffering from some sort of cancer or ulcer, I don't know, and they managed to get some potatoes to give him mashed potatoes with a small piece of butter, and even that he could not swallow. So I was fed the mashed potatoes that had been made for the priest, and that was the best meal, the only good meal that I had during that period. And since then, I love mashed potatoes
To this day.
to this day.
To this day. So this is the summer of 1944. It's now August 1944. You're 6 years old, separated from your mom and of course your dad, and your sisters are in the other boarding school. While you were there, you were liberated. Tell us about the liberation that you experienced.
A memorable experience, actually. Uh, yeah, one of the boys from the school had left the school, and he came back saying the Allies are coming. So we all went on the main street, and we saw, like on this picture, you know, soldiers with a different helmet. It was not the German helmet anymore, and smiling, giving us a chocolate, cigarettes, chewing gum.
Cigarettes, you say too, right?
No, not to me, but
Okay.
I was a bit too young for that. And anyway, the headmistress was not letting go of my hand. She was always holding my hand during that time, and it was the first time in my life that I heard about Americans.
I mean, heard about them at all? You had never heard of Americans?
No, never until that day.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah.
You knew
No,
who the British were? Yeah.
we knew everything about the Germans, of course, the Italians, the British, the Americans. Where do they come from? I had no idea. Needless to say that I fell in love. But
Albert, then soon after that, of course, you were able to reunite with your sisters and your mother. Tell us what you remember about that.
well, actually, one day, when once we were liberated, they restored the train service, and my mother was on the first train to come to visit us. She was so worried about us, and she came to see us. And one day, I was, hanging around in the playground with the other kids, and I see my sisters coming and say, "Guess who's here? Guess who's here?" I had no idea. A 6-year-old. It's amazing how fast we can forget about our loved ones, and I had
Mhm.
no idea who could be there. So I pushed my sisters and around, and I saw my mother behind them. And when I saw my mother, I jumped into her arms, and I must say she was appalled to see how skinny I was.
Yeah.
And she had ration tickets to buy food. She bought a loaf of bread, and we swallowed the loaf of bread in no time. That's how hungry we were. We were constantly hungry. And the bread was not good. It was dark bread. We were dreaming of white bread, but the white bread came after the war. And in those days, it was dark bread, and it was with bran and I don't know what else. They say they even sometimes put sawdust in the bread. So it
And,
was,
and Albert, aside from eating that loaf of bread very quickly initially, you had to have some sort of special treatments though because of your poor nutrition and how much weight you had lost. So
yeah, that was when we got home actually. Uh, when my mother took me home the same day, and for
mhm.
whatever reason I don't know, she had to go back, and it was far. It was very far. She had to take a metro and a train to come, and then walk a few miles because the train wouldn't go all the way to Montfermeil. It would stop, I don't know where exactly, but so she went back the next day to pick up my sisters, and she came back in the evening, and in the meantime she left me under the custody of our neighbor, Madame Ménétrier, who had the key.
The same family that you'd spent a few nights with.
Yes,
Yep.
and and there was a green apple in the house. That was the only thing that I could eat there to be eaten. So I grabbed it and I swallowed it in no time. And as soon as I finished, I heard the key. It was Madame Ménétrier who was checking on me. And when she saw that I had been eating something and she found out that it was a green apple, she was not happy about that. And anyway, but that's all we had in the house. And my mother came back the same day, the evening, with my sisters, and we were home. Meanwhile, my father, who had been on the island of Alderney, in May, 1 month before D-Day, the Germans, the Allies were bombarding the Straits of Dover, and to make the Germans believe that if there was an invasion, it would take place in the Straits of Dover, which is the shortest distance between France and Britain.
Make them think it was there rather than Normandy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They thought the landing would take place in the Straits of Dover. So they were bombarding there. And so the Germans transferred all the inmates with my father to the Straits of Dover, and my father was working under the bombardments of the Allies. And my father told me one story about that. He said one day there was a bombardment like that, and when that happened, they had to lay flat on the ground. And my father was on the ground next to a German soldier. And when the raid was over, my father could stand up, and the German soldier had been killed.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Albert, you shared with me on another time that as they were bombed by the Allies at these where they were doing the construction work, there was no shelter typically for the forced laborers, so they had to just lie flat on the ground in the hopes that they would not get hit by those bombs.
That's what happened. Yeah, when he was laying flat on the ground when the German soldier next to him was killed.
Killed.
He could have been killed too, actually.
Absolutely, and obviously could have been killed earlier in that terrible accident you shared with us. So, at some point after your father and the rest of the, I think some 800 or 900 forced laborers, they were then moved. They were taken by train to head further inland. Tell us about that.
Yes, when the Allies were pushing the Germans back towards Germany, east, at one point the Germans decided to transfer all the inmates. There were 900 inmates, and they put them on a train bound for Germany. We don't know what they had in store for them. Maybe they wanted to send them to a death camp, or maybe they wanted to use them in a factory as slave labor. We don't know. But anyway, the train was stopped in Belgium by Belgian resistance fighters. And there was a battle between the resistance and the German soldiers. And in the confusion, the Germans released the 900 inmates. And my father walked all the way from Belgium to Paris. It was about a 150 mile trek. It took him a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, I don't know. And he came back home. And he came back home the morning of Rosh Hashanah, which is a Jewish New Year.
And this was September 1944, right? Yep.
September 22nd or 23rd, 1944. And my mother was dressing me to go to synagogue for the first time, because we hadn't been to a synagogue, of course, for 4 years. And there was a knock on the door, and this time it was my father who was coming back. We knew that he was coming back because he had been detained. He was deported with a cousin, one of his cousins, and the cousin came back early and told my mother that he was on his way. So we knew that we could expect him back, but we didn't know exactly when. And he came back the morning of Rosh Hashanah.
And do you remember what that was like to have your father come back?
Of course.
Yeah.
I remember when he left, with his gas mask and all, he went to the metro, he took the metro, and I remember when he came back.
Albert, before I share with you a comment from somebody in the audience, your father, of course, he was almost killed in a terrible accident, almost, had to flee and worry about bombs. He's on a train that gets attacked by the resistance, and then he walks 150 or more miles to get to you. What kind of condition was your father in?
My father was a sort of Superman, very strong. I would not have survived a tenth of what he went through, actually. He was very strong, so he survived. And he walked. I think he walked. There was no transport or anything. Maybe sometimes a truck would take him. I have no knowledge of that, but I think most of the time he was walking.
Yeah.
From Belgium, 150 miles away, to Paris.
Albert, we have two pictures I'd like for you to tell us about them. The first is of you, and then we have one of your father. Maybe we can bring those up.
That's me in school in 1945 or 46.
So that's after your liberation, maybe after the war?
After the war.
Yeah, after the war. And then we have a photograph of your father.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and if you can see here the scars, that's from his injuries when he fell off a cliff.
It looks like a major indentation in his head.
Yes, exactly. It looked like a question mark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Albert, we have a comment from Donna, and Donna is from Verona, Oregon. And she just doesn't have a question. She just says, it is so important to share your stories. Thank you. And then Rosie says, you are brave and compelling and generous. Thank you. So some really nice comments from audience members.
Thank you.
And here's a question from another audience member from Brazil, Celine from Brazil. Thanks for sharing your story. And she asks, as a child, what were your thoughts on what you were experiencing? Did your mother make you aware of everything? Or did she try to protect you from, why you had to move and the fear and anti-Semitism?
It was both, actually. She was trying to protect me from the dangers, from the idea of the dangers we were facing. But, I was a kid. I didn't realize what danger meant, but I knew that, we could have been taken away. That
Yeah.
I knew.
And had so many.
I've gone. I don't know where we would have been taken to, but I knew that there was a danger.
And in fact, as you've described, you've had so many close calls. Albert, I have one last question for you, if that's okay. And that is, tell us why you continue to share your firsthand account of what you and your family went through during the Holocaust.
Before I answer this question, I would like to tell us a story. One day,
Please.
my mother we were not allowed to go on public transportation. And one day my mother had to run an errand in Paris. And she took me along. I was a baby, a toddler, let's say. And when we came back at at the station there was an identity check. And that meant, my mother had identity paper saying Juif. They had a big stamp, Juif, Jewish, on it. So that meant if she had shown her identity card to one of the police or the guards or the militia who were doing the identity check, I wouldn't be here today.
Right.
And my mother took me in her arms. She pretended to look into a purse. She walked between two guards, and they didn't stop her. If one of the guards had said, "Ma'am, I haven't seen your papers," I wouldn't be here today. That's just as simple as that. So to go back to your question, what was the question? I forgot.
The question is, tell us why you continue to take the time to share what you experienced with your family during the Holocaust.
I'm not the only one, actually. We are 50 at the museum, and we are 50 because we lost a lot of them to old age. And but we think that we had a unique experience that is worth telling, so that the kids, the new generations, and even the military, actually, sometimes we speak to military people. They have to be aware, to hear about our stories.
Mm-hmm.
It's very important. So, if you don't want to repeat that kind of tragic history, you have to be aware of it.
Right. Well, we are so grateful that you do. So thank you so much, Albert, for sharing what you went through with us. I know that you couldn't even begin to touch the surface of everything that happened. You just gave that example a moment ago of another close call. There's no question that there were other close calls that you don't even know about. And I'm sure that our fellow audience members here not only are grateful for you sharing this extraordinary account of what you went through with your family, but are so aware of the description of separation after separation from your father, from your mother, from your sisters, and how you found refuge with strangers and neighbors. And what really comes across in such a profound way is your mother's resilience, bravery, and resourcefulness. And so thank you for continuing to be willing to share your story with us. I look forward to another opportunity for you to do this. Thank you, Albert, so very much.
Thank you.
Before we close our program, I want to acknowledge that 12 years ago tomorrow, we lost a valued and beloved member of our museum family, Officer Stephen Tyrone Johns. While protecting visitors and colleagues, Officer Johns was fatally shot on June 10th, 2009 by an avowed anti-Semite, Holocaust denier, and racist. Officer John's outgoing personality and generous spirit endeared him to all who entered the museum. His memory occupies a permanent place in our hearts. I would also like to take a moment to thank our donors. First Person is made possible through generous support from the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation, with additional funding from the Arlene and Daniel Fisher Foundation. Please join us again on July 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation with Holocaust survivor Irene Weiss. Irene was just 13 years old when she and her family were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Irene and her older sister were forced to work at the camp, while most of the family were sent to their immediate deaths. Please join us next month to hear Irene's Holocaust experiences. Thank you all for watching today's First Person program.